lot of people want to watch how I make them. Buy my cables off AliExpress, the ones I get normally. This is our 0 to 10 or 0 to 5 as we're going to convert it. This will be our power, 24 volt, and brown being our ground. A lot of questions I get is how I make it all compact and how it's all nicely put together. That's how I do it. Started by cutting this down fairly short, about yay long, trim and flux and solder that part. Okay, that's trimmed, soldered. Camera's not focusing obviously, but that's about it. Then I take my 2 resistors. I use 2.7K. I leave one straight. I give one this nice Mad Wicked bend. So you can basically solder them together as such. I have shakes myself, so to make things easier I solder these together before connecting to the rest of the wire. So I'll be right back. Okay, so there we go. 2 resistors soldered. I trim them down slightly. There's a little bit of focus there. There we go. And from there I connect it with the rest of the harness. This bent one I normally make it so it will line up over the brown, or over the blue, and this one I make it so it lines up over the brown. See why in a little bit. Again, I've got shakes, so don't diss my poor soldering skills sometimes. Okay, there we go. Now you'll note from here, this resistor will connect with or directly to the ground, or when you're using a patch cable, this will connect directly to the ground. This one will connect to either your orange and white striped or your blue and white striped on a patch cable, typically according to the diagrams that are on the thread. This one will eventually also be connected to your DC negative and to the solid color, either orange or solid green, according to the patch cable or the diagrams that are also in the thread. This here again will be your positive 24 from your DC jack and the negative for the DC jack as well. That's the start on how I keep everything all nice and content. Next will be to solder the 2.5K resistor on the one side to the ground. Okay, there we go. Solder to the ground. I trim all these off even. Just a pair of side cutters, trim all the wires so they're together and even. And there's basically the next step for it. We've got our ground with our resistor, our open resistor, and our 24 volts. Next I will be connecting my DC power and my Ethernet. I'm just going to prep my cord and I'll be right back, but there's the gist of it. Okay, so here we have our orange stripe, which will be our 0 to 10 from the apex, our ground orange, green, which is our ground, and our blue-white stripe, which again will be a 0 to 10. I've already soldered this on to the ground of my DC connector. To test continuity, it's the outside ring. You want to make sure that this ring to your ground is your ground. The middle pin is going to be your positive. Most cables, if it's all black, the stripe will be positive. And no stripe or no lines will be negative, but always be sure to test it because all manufacturers are different. I've also just stripped and tinned all the parts. We've got, ironically enough, someone from eBay bought one off me last night, so I'm making their cable today, and they ordered a double, so it'll give a little idea of how I put it all together. So down here, I've already made up a second one of my little harnesses, slid over I normally use between 3 and 4 inches of dual wall adhesive heat shrink, seals it up nicely. Start out by soldering my ground on my ground, and have a sip of coffee before I do that. Okay, so where things get a little fun. So I've soldered on my ground for my DC, my solid orange, to the resistor and the brown that are all one solder, one joint. And from here, connect the sprig. It's tricky, a little touchy. Now make sure your DC is down because it's going to go underneath it. You're going to connect the other resistor to the orange stripe. And then give it a bit of a spin. And your positive DC connection to your blue. Okay. And there you have it. Got our brown and ground and resistor coming off the yellow to the brown, connected to the DC negative and the negative on your Ethernet. Your next resistor is connected just up to the positive, or the 0 to 10 volt from your apex, and the last line is your 24 volt. From here, I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other side, only using the other 2 wires to connect to that. And I'll be back to show you the whole bundle. Another thing, the way that I do it normally, to hold the resistor and the wire together, because if you heat this up too much, that connection likes to separate from the ground to the resistor. I typically use an alligator clip just from the bottom up, just to hold it in place. Again, just helps me with my tremors. It gives me an extra second here to connect these 2 pieces. It sometimes takes a little bit of fidgeting to make sure it's got enough slack and convenience to do it. Just be patient with it. It's a wire. And I connect those. And again, make sure your DC is down. It's the only way that my bundle really works to put it together nicely afterwards. Drop off my alligator clip here. All my joints are normally pre-tinned and I'm just adding a little flux to give it a little clean. Tell those wires to connect together with some flux. Good to go. Pre-tinning is very important for anything you're doing, or at least I personally think so. I'm not the soldering god or the electrician that some people out here might be, but there we go. So there's the cluster, as confusing as it is at this particular point in time. Your 2 separate wires. Again, let's get this back into the camera. Focus would be great. So, got our green and blue stripe, or blue and white striped, and our green solid ground. So this particular harness will be controlled by your V1 and V2. Sorry, the V1 or V3, according to whichever one you select. There's your 24 volt positive, your apex from the apex 0 to 10, and your ground bundle 0 to 10 from your apex, your negative from your DC, another resistor, your harness ground, and then this turns into 0 to 5. And this one is your orange, and your orange and white stripe. This could be controlled by V2 or V4 depending on which one it's plugged into. On a side note, resistors, everywhere I read and from what I tested and everything I know about resistors is it says that any resistors will work. That's not the case. I'll also be adding a note and getting them to update my main thread. It's not any resistors. I again use 2.7K. I've also used 1K with no issues. I did recently review someone who had made their own harness. And they only used 10 ohm resistors. That does nothing at all. So I definitely suggest you don't use 10 ohm. Again, the minimum I've used is 1K because that's all I have. But I normally use 2K. I just had a lot of them, so that's what I'm using, and I've never had an issue with them. Probably done over 60 double cables at this point, so almost basically 120 pumps controlled by these things that I've made. Never had an issue with 2.7K. Going on months now, and no one has ever emailed me or reported any issues with the harness as is. I run one myself on two WP-40s. I also have a Jebao DC 12000 that I will hopefully be making a harness for shortly. However, I'm currently out of extra parts. These are my last two DC cables. As soon as my new parts come in, I'll be making one for my Jebao DC 12000 as well. So there you have it. From here, I will tape this joint separate. Same thing with this one, and then wrap this and wrap that. Wrap my ground, and then wrap it all up together. Just get my pieces cut and good to go. Alright, so I've taped off both my 24 DC volts plus 24s, and then I'm just tape this off by threading a big piece of tape through it. Get it fold over, and then from here that separated everything, so I just wrapped the whole kit and caboodle, as they say. Yes, the other options, of course, is to use heat shrink. I sometimes do. I didn't on here just to keep everything open and easier to see. And there's one bundle all just wrapped up. And do the same to the other side. Thread your electrical tape through it. It up and over. The whole thing up wrapped now. And voila. There's everything all tight. It's not much wider than the original cables were in the first place. Keeps all nice and content. We'll eventually wrap the whole item after I test the cable. I test it obviously here before I go too crazy with the tape, but that'll just be taped in like that. Wrap the whole thing with electrical tape, slide the sheath over, shrink it up, and good to go. So again, at this point is when I test the cable, make sure everything's hooked up properly. I'll plug it into my Apex. My two WP-40s, just by removing the old one that I've got on there that's mine, and plug this one in, let it run for a few minutes. Normally try it out in a few different variations and speeds and everything just to make sure everything's turning fine. It's normally a pretty quick check because when you've made 60 of these already, it's more than 60 now, I've kind of lost count. It's kind of straightforward and everything's the same. Can't really make a mistake as long as you match the colors up. But I will go test the cable now, then I will wrap from like a tape's width here, and then just wrap the whole thing down to a tape's width here. As a comparison, let's just basically that whole section here. I'll wrap with electrical tape as well, just to give some added strength, but that will be wrapped between my thumbs. Basically this whole section in here. Yeah, I'll be back in a minute. Alright, everything's tested, working beautiful, like I kind of assumed. So again, we're going to tape up. I go right from the edge of the cable, just the width of the tape onto the cable and just wrap the hell out of it. It's going to be a lot easier off camera here, sorry. And again, when I'm done wrapping it, I normally go about a tape's width off the Ethernet as well, just to make sure it's holding everything secure and it's all the way through. There you go, and then I just wrap it up. Normally do a second row on the way back, cut her off. Alright, taped up, like I said, it's about the width of that lid when compared to what it was before earlier. This is about 4 inches. It'll actually cover it nicely. And heat shrink that together. The whole time while wrapping, I try to keep this first harness straight through to this Ethernet, to this DC cable, just so that you kind of know which wire powers which pump. It's not really necessary, but can be handy if you are using your EB8 to plug it in. You don't need to plug these into your EB8 because your variable speed port is what will actually control the power. Just by turning the variable speed port to off, it will shut your pump off. My soldering iron. So yeah, so I'll go heat shrink it, and basically it's considered done. That's it. Alright, there we have it. For 2 cables, my 2 DCs, my Ethernet, make my own patch cables, have my own crimping tool. You can see even in here, to make sure you're using a patch cable and not a crossover, make sure your wires are all right. Got my orange stripe, solid orange, green stripe, solid blue, blue stripe, solid green, brown stripe, solid brown. Again, there's diagrams in my first post. Your colors don't need to match up with this, but make sure that if they don't match up with this, they're going to connect properly in here, such as your main ones being your white, orange, and your orange. It doesn't matter what color they are, as long as it coordinates with what we just soldered in here. So if your orange is a blue, make sure you use the blue up there. That's all. That's the gist of them. Again, I'd use a dual wall adhesive heat shrink. Seals it up pretty nice and strong. When it all cools off, it's actually pretty solid. It doesn't really move. Roll that up, and actually I'll test it one more time before I mail it to the gentleman, just because I want to make sure nothing happened while I was working it hard and wrapping it and heat shrinking it, and I just like to do it for my own peace of mind to make sure before I put it in the envelope everything is up and running perfectly. Everyone knows how to contact me. Send me a PM if you have any questions, comments, concerns. Yeah. Hope everyone enjoys making them themselves. It's been a fun venture for me and a fun project, but yeah, have yourself a good day.